In 2011, something happened that almost never happens. A head of state stood before cameras, looked directly into the eyes of one man, and apologized, not for something that had happened that week, not even that year, but for a decision made more than half a century earlier. Why? What could force an entire government, 57 years later, to publicly admit it had been wrong? The answer wasn't hidden in a courtroom. It wasn't buried in a military archive. It wasn't even made inside Guatemala. To find it, we have to follow a trail that begins with something so ordinary, almost nobody paid attention to it. Everything that follows comes from the files of the people who did it, declassified, catalogued, sitting in a public archive right now. Some of it was released willingly. Some took 40 years and a lawsuit, and one page in it is still blacked out today. You will not be asked to take my word for any of this, only to watch where the evidence goes. This is how you take a country apart. Step 1 begins decades earlier, with a company most Americans knew only as a sticker on their breakfast fruit. The United Fruit Company of Boston did not just sell bananas. In Guatemala, it effectively was the economy. It owned more than 500,000 acres of the country's best farmland and left roughly 85% of it unplanted, held in reserve. It controlled the country's main Atlantic port. It owned the railroad that ran to that port. It ran the telegraph. For decades, it had operated nearly tax-free, under friendly dictators happy to keep it that way. Guatemalans had a name for it: El Pulpo, the octopus, a tentacle in everything. That arrangement, a foreign corporation running a nation like a plantation, is what gave the world a phrase you still use today: the Banana Republic. As long as Guatemala stayed a dictatorship, the arrangement was safe. In 1944, it stopped being safe. That year, Guatemalans rose up, threw out their dictator, and then did something remarkable. They held the first genuinely free elections in their history, and the winners actually took office. Guatemalans call what followed the 10 years of spring. In 1950, a reform-minded young colonel named Jacobo Arbenz won the presidency with around 65% of the vote. His signature law, Decree 900, reads, even today, as strikingly moderate. It took only uncultivated land from the biggest estates, paid for it in government bonds, and gave it to landless farming families. Arbenz even handed over 1,700 acres of his own family's land under his own law. But the largest holder of idle land in Guatemala was the octopus. And here, the company walked into a trap it had built for itself. Compensation was set by a property's declared tax value, and United Fruit had spent years swearing to the tax office that its land was worth almost nothing. So the government offered just over $1 million. The company demanded nearly 16. The gap between those numbers was the exact size of the company's own tax fraud. And rather than pay the difference, United Fruit decided to remove the government. A banana company cannot overthrow a country, but it can hire the men who can. First, it had Edward Bernays, nephew of Sigmund Freud, the father of modern public relations, the man who once convinced American women to smoke by rebranding cigarettes as torches of freedom. Bernays flew planeloads of American journalists to Guatemala on carefully staged tours, fed them the story of a Soviet beachhead growing in Central America, and watched the headlines bloom exactly where he had planted them. The record showed no meaningful Soviet control of Guatemala. It didn't matter. The word communist did the work the facts couldn't. And in Washington, United Fruit barely needed the press. It already had the government. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles' old law firm had negotiated the company's sweetheart contracts. His brother Alan ran the CIA and had held company stock. In August 1953, President Eisenhower approved Operation PBSUCCESS, roughly $3 million to take apart a democracy of 3 million people. Here is what the CIA understood. It could not beat the Guatemalan army, so it set out to beat the army's nerve instead. The main weapon was a radio station, the Voice of Liberation, which claimed to broadcast from a rebel camp deep inside Guatemala. It was recorded by actors far outside the country on tapes packed with fiction, phantom battalions, mass defections, a rebel army swelling by the hour. None of it existed. The real force was about 480 men under an exiled colonel, Carlos Castillo Armas, waiting across the border in Honduras. When they finally crossed, in June 1954, they lost virtually every real engagement they fought. It didn't matter. Overhead, a handful of CIA planes, Guatemalans nicknamed them sulfatos, circled the capital, dropping leaflets, dropping smoke bombs, and when ordnance ran short, dropping empty soda bottles that shrieked like falling bombs. On the radio, the imaginary rebel army kept advancing. Inside the capital, real officers weighed a real choice: stand by a President Washington had marked for destruction and risk bringing the Marines down on Guatemala, or make him disappear themselves. On June 27, 1954, the army handed Arbenz an ultimatum. That night, he resigned over national radio. The coup had won without winning a single battle that mattered. And this is where every other version of this story rolls the credits. What actually happened next is worse. They did not just remove Jacobo Arbenz, they dismantled him. When he left for exile, the new regime made sure he passed the airport cameras stripped to his underwear. The elected president of Guatemala, photographed half-naked, so the humiliation would travel further than any bullet could. Then the world he landed in kept shrinking. Guatemala stripped his citizenship. Country after country found polite reasons not to keep him. He drifted. Mexico, Switzerland, France, Czechoslovakia, Moscow, Uruguay, Havana. A president without a country, drinking harder, trailed everywhere by intelligence files. In 1965, his daughter Arabella, an actress, 25 years old, took her own life. People close to him said he never recovered. In January 1971, Jacobo Arbenz was found dead in the bathtub of his home in Mexico City. He was 57. It took until 1995 for his remains to come home to Guatemala. And the country they came home to had just emerged from 36 years of the Civil War. The coup ignited, a war that killed an estimated 200,000 people. That is what one balance sheet problem bought. And now the parts nobody tells you. The parts where the operation ate its own. 5 days after Arbenz resigned, the United States government sued United Fruit for being a monopoly. The same government that had just helped destroy a democracy to protect the octopus dragged it into court under antitrust law. And by 1958, the company was signing a decree that forced it to begin breaking itself apart. The empire the coup was built to save unraveled anyway, piece by piece, until what remained rebranded under a friendlier name, Chiquita. The coup's men traveled further. A young CIA officer from the operations propaganda side, E. Howard Hunt, surfaced 18 years later organizing a break-in at the Watergate, fieldcraft rehearsed on Guatemala, redeployed against Washington itself. Among the foreigners in Guatemala City who watched the Sulfatos circle was an unknown Argentine doctor named Ernesto Guevara. And what he took from 1954 was a conviction that peaceful reform gets you overthrown. He carried it to Cuba, and in 1997, the CIA finally declassified part of its Guatemala files, including a training manual titled A Study of Assassination and lists of Guatemalans marked for elimination. The names are redacted to this day. Which brings us back to October 2011. The National Palace. The president of Guatemala turns to that gray-haired man, Jacobo Arbenz Villanova, the son, and apologizes on behalf of the state for 1954. 57 years after the coup. 40 years after his father was found in that bathtub. No one from United Fruit was ever punished. No one from the CIA was ever punished. The only apology came from the victim's own country, because the governments that actually did it have never offered one. Today, the phrase Banana Republic sits in your vocabulary, even on your high street, stripped of its history. Now you know where it comes from. A country that tried democracy and a company that found it inconvenient. So here is the question this file leaves open. Guatemala's spring lasted 10 years. If Decree 900 had been allowed to stand, if the spring had run for 20 years or 50, what would Guatemala be today? Tell me what you think below. And know this, Guatemala was not the end of the playbook. It was the rehearsal. 7 years later, the same file opened on a new country, one whose ground held the metals the atomic age ran on. That story is next in the archives. Subscribe, because the Obscura archives are full of things the world was never supposed to forget.